HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Way They Were, How Epic Battles and Bruised Egos Brought a Classic Hollywood Love Story to the Screen, by Robert Hofler, read by Paul Boehmer. Chapter 1. Barbra Streisand and Katie Morosky. Arthur remembers it being 125 pages. I remember reading a 50-page treatment, said Barbra Streisand. Regardless of how many pages Arthur Laurents had written of a synopsis, or an outline, or a so-called treatment, Streisand wanted those pages titled The Way We Were, and she wanted them now. I fell in love with it, she gushed. More important, Streisand put her enthusiasm into the only words that count in Hollywood. I want this to be my next movie, she told the producer, Ray Stark. Stark had produced Funny Girl on Broadway and also brought it to the screen with Streisand reprising the role of Fanny Brice, who happened to be the producer's mother-in-law. The New York theater had long been home to Jewish artists who refused to hide their heritage. The movies? Not so much. Streisand in the movie Funny Girl was historic, a Jewish actress playing a proudly Jewish character. The Way We Were would build on that breakthrough, providing Streisand with her first dramatic role in which being Jewish was again central to the story. With The Way We Were, she was going back to the well of Funny Girl, only she was delving deeper, much deeper. Again, it was the fairy tale of Cinderella who, falling in love with the handsome Prince Charming, sheds her sooty persona and is made to feel beautiful. The fact that Omar Sharif, in the movie version of Funny Girl, wasn't Jewish, despite playing a character named Nicky Arnstein, diluted the romance's Semitism to make it more palatable to general audiences. What Laurents delivered with The Way We Were would be radically different due to the male lead character. What he wrote puts on display the various tropes of what it meant to be Jewish in America, and how different it was to be Gentile in America. He then let his two protagonists, Katie Morosky and Hubbell Gardner, meet in the most intimate of contexts, love and marriage. Katie represents discrimination, morality, and a fraught past. Hubbell represents privilege, aestheticism, and a wide-open future. The political split embodied by the two characters is obvious. More subtle is the aesthetics divide, which has Katie telling Hubbell, "I'm not attractive in the right way, am I? I don't have the right style for you, do I?" What could go wrong when such a couple fell in love and got married and had a baby? Jews have a name for Gentiles, especially those with whom they are involved in a romantic relationship. The Gentile woman is called a shiksa. The Gentile man is called a shigetz. Laurents often used another name that encapsulated both the shiksa and the shigetz. He called them a fantasy wasp. He didn't use the term to describe only Katie's Hubbell. He used it to describe a Gentile character named Alex in the play My Good Name, which he wrote 2 decades later, and which was first produced in 1997. Alex is married to a woman named Rachel, the name of Katie and Hubbell's baby in The Way We Were, who is essentially a middle-aged Katie. She loves The Sound of Crystal in the Palm Court at the Plaza Hotel, where Katie and Hubbell last see each other. For Rachel, the music of that expensive cutlery represents the seductive aestheticism of her wealthy, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant businessman husband. It means the same thing to Katie when she dines there with Hubbell in Lawrence's novel, The Way We Were, which was published a year before the film's release. The sound of crystal, as both Rachel and Katie hear it, also means that they do not really belong at the Palm Court. They are both outsiders. Not so subtly on Lawrence's part, the Rachel of My Good Name has written a book of poems titled Crystal Nights, which has nothing to do with eating and drinking at the Plaza's Palm Court, and everything to do with Kristallnacht, or The Night of Broken Glass, the November 1938 pogrom in Nazi Germany, during which thousands of synagogues and businesses were destroyed and hundreds of Jews murdered. Rachel, like Katie, is a very moral woman and a political activist. What is either of these female characters doing in the company of a fantasy wasp or shigerts, much less falling in love with and marrying one? It's a question Ray Stark did not ask himself upon reading the treatment for The Way We Were on a cross-country flight home to Los Angeles in the spring of 1970. He did not see a debate on morality and aestheticism in the 123 pages, not 50 or 125 pages, that Laurents had given him in New York City. The producer was smarter than that. Raymond Otto Stark, in 1931, at age 15, was the youngest student ever admitted to Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. When he read the treatment for The Way We Were, he saw money, and he saw another massive hit starring Streisand, whom he just happened to have under contract at the time. She owed him not one, but two more movies after their screen collaborations for Funny Girl and The Owl and the Pussycat. Stark rushed to a telephone at LAX the moment his airplane landed. He didn't wait for his chauffeur to limousine him to his Holmby Hills mansion, home to a menagerie of statues, their rock-hard buttocks a favorite topic of conversation, when the producer escorted female guests he wanted to bed across the grounds. Who didn't want their backside compared to an Alberto Giacometti or a Henry Moore? At the airport, Stark phoned Laurents to say, "It's wonderful, I want to do it." Stark commissioned him on the spot, and Laurents delivered a first draft of The Way We Were screenplay in a matter of weeks. According to documents, it became the property of Raystar Productions at Columbia Pictures Corporation in Hollywood on August 14, 1970. The 54-year-old writer had provided the books for the classic Broadway musicals West Side Story and Gypsy, but nothing with the name Arthur Laurents on it had found much approval from either the critics or the public since the late 1950s. Suddenly, with The Way We Were, Laurents again stood on the receiving end of telephone calls overflowing with effusive approval. "You know what you're proposing here. This is dynamite," film director Sydney Pollack told Laurents as soon as he read the treatment. "This will be the first ever blacklist movie, the first one to show how it was." Laurents knew the subject firsthand. He had lived that right-wing political nightmare in the late 1940s after writing the screenplay for Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, among other movies. Over the years, Laurents never gave an interview without failing to mention how his movie career got upended when the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, swung into action in 1947 and declared not only the State Department but also the motion picture industry a hotbed of communism. Hollywood had one major asset over Capitol Hill, and HUAC stood ready to exploit it. It started there because the House Un-American Activities Committee knew it could get publicity if it investigated celebrities. Laurents recalled, "American voters barely knew the names of their representatives in the U.S. Congress, much less anyone working in the State Department. But in those soon-to-disappear days before every citizen owned a TV set, they went to the movies by the tens of millions on a weekly basis." John Wayne and James Stewart weren't commies, but maybe Charlie Chaplin and John Garfield were, and who knew how many others working there in Tinseltown were Reds, especially in an industry founded and run by Jews. For HUAC, it all came down to publicity, and even a lowly screenwriter like Laurents got caught in the committee's mischief-making sweep through the Hollywood Hills when, in 1950, Red Channels, a right-wing pamphlet subtitled "The Report of Communist Influence in Radio and Television," and published by 3 ex-FBI agents, listed him as a subversive. For a few months in 1952, he even lost his U.S. passport, and all because the Daily Worker, the official publication of the Communist Party USA, had once reviewed Home of the Brave, his 1946 Broadway play about anti-Semitism in the Army. It was a horrible time to be an American, and Laurents eventually escaped back to Broadway. Who knew that one day he would get a screenplay out of those evil, dark days in La La Land? If nothing else, The Way We Were would be his sweet revenge. Streisand, unlike Laurents and Pollack, was less interested in the film's politics, at least in the beginning, before she found herself on President Richard Nixon's so-called enemies list a few months before the 1973 release of The Way We Were. Among the film's principals, only Stark could have cared even less about politics. In the beginning, Streisand's real interest lied elsewhere. She had heard somewhere that the esteemed film director David Lean once decreed that if a script contained 5 great scenes, it would be a success. She counted 5 such scenes in The Way We Were, all of them featuring her. That is, there were 5 great scenes, each of them featuring her playing Katie Morosky, the 1930s Jewish campus communist who falls in love with the college's Gentile golden boy athlete, Hubbell Gardner. She especially liked a scene that envisions Katie at home in her tiny Manhattan apartment, crying on the phone. Even in his treatment, Laurents had completely fleshed it out with dialogue, and begging Hubbell to take her back after they've just broken up in the wake of World War II. "I can't sleep, Hubbell," she says. "It would help if I could talk to someone." What also impressed Streisand was a small detail that Laurents stuck in his treatment. Katie never uses a 4-letter word until she moves to Hollywood. "That's me! You've got it!" exclaimed Streisand. The foul word spoken isn't the F-bomb. Stark would remove all those from the script. In the scene, Katie calls a Hollywood agent who has named names to HUAC a shit. Streisand got to say it for the cameras, but, along with about another 60 minutes focusing on the Hollywood blacklist in the movie, the entire scene hit the cutting room floor even before preview audiences got a first look at The Way We Were. Streisand and Stark and Laurents and Pollack. It was a bizarre, lopsided rectangle of big talent and even bigger egos, with Robert Redford soon to be the reluctant odd man looking for a way out to escape this box of movie popcorn, or, as he put it, that Ray Stark ego trip. It's why making the movie turned into such a nightmare, and why, ultimately, the movie became a Hollywood classic. Since the American Film Institute started keeping track of such monumental stuff, The Way We Were has always found itself ensconced on the list of the top 10 movie romances of all time, in the august company of Casablanca and Gone with the Wind. Pollack bore the day-to-day horrors of shepherding The Way We Were to the screen, and he claimed that Stark, because of his 4-picture contract with Streisand, had an ownership thing with the star. Ray and Barbra, it was a very, very complicated relationship, said Judith Roscoe, a Stark employee who worked as a script consultant on The Way We Were. While Stark expected the star to pay obeisance, Streisand never forgot, or more likely never forgave, Fran Arnstein Stark for putting her through the indignity of a pre-Funny Girl casting contest. The producer's wife didn't want just any singer to play her famous mother on stage. Fanny Brice's daughter insisted on an endless decathlon of meetings and auditions, only to prefer an actress who was not Jewish. She wanted an actress who was an even bigger star on Broadway than her mother had ever been. Her first choice for the role was the theater's singing sweetheart. Fran wanted Mary Martin to play her mother. Funny Girl composer Julie Stein remembered one of the go-see auditions and how the young Streisand looked awful. All her clothes were out of thrift shops. I saw Fran Stark staring at her, obvious distaste on her face. Taking cues from his wife, Ray Stark said of the young Streisand, "She's terrible. She'll never play my mother-in-law." At the time, the popular comedian Kay Ballard was campaigning hard for the role, and even added the Brice standard, "My Man," to her nightclub repertoire. No surprise, she also ran into a roadblock thrown up by the Brice Arnstein offspring. Fran Stark had this fantasy that her mother was this beautiful, delicate creature, said Ballard. Fanny was beautiful after you got to know her, but not beautiful in the way Fran wanted to portray her. With Streisand, it wasn't just the old funky clothes that this Jewish girl from Brooklyn would make fashionable and chic in record time. With Streisand, there was the nose. In a review of her cabaret act in 1961, Variety cracked that perhaps a little corrective schnoz bob might be an element to be considered. A critic at the New York Journal-American delivered an even crueler attack, calling her an amiable ant-eater. Brice herself eventually tired of being a sight gag, as she put it, and submitted her nose to a surgeon's knife and hammer. On that sensitive subject of nasal reconstruction, which she assiduously eschewed, Streisand might have agreed with the sardonic Dorothy Parker, who once wrote that Baby Snooks had cut off her nose to spite her race. Radio fans of Brice didn't know the word schnoz from schnook from schmuck, but 20 years later, in the early 1960s, TV watchers couldn't mistake Streisand's calling herself a nice Jewish girl in repeated appearances on Mike Wallace's PM East, The Jack Paar Show, and The Tonight Show. These appearances took place before Stein composed People and Don't Rain on My Parade, songs that he wrote specifically for her voice, with its multi-octave range, songs that went from E below middle C to a high F. And even earlier, Streisand had made being Jewish and being from Brooklyn in that order, part of her shtick in cabaret appearances at the basement venue Bonsoir in Greenwich Village. It was where Stein first heard her and became an early, avid fan. Laurents heard the young singer a few months later. Hot off writing the books for West Side Story and Gypsy, he momentarily put aside his typewriter to direct his first Broadway musical. His assistant, on I Can Get It For You Wholesale, remembered Streisand's audition for Laurents. "When she came to Wholesale, what a wreck she was," said Ashley Feinstein. Barbra wore strange clothes and black-dyed hair. Impossible to think she would ever be on the screen. She was also this Jewish girl from Brooklyn, and she had no compunction about letting people know she was Jewish. Her audition for Wholesale, set in New York's garment district during the Great Depression, inspired the young Streisand to indulge her penchant for antique clothes. Since the action took place in the 1930s, I showed up in a 1930s fur coat that I'd bought in a thrift shop for $10, she remembered. For that audition, Streisand requested a chair, a most unusual request, because she wanted to sing sitting, not standing. Laurents, like Stein, fell in love at that first hearing, if not at first sight. The director-writer recalled, "She walked in and knocked me out." In those days, what Barbra looked like was not considered attractive. Always the contrarian, Streisand's Broadway mentor didn't leave it there. "All this talk about her nose is nonsense," Laurents would quickly add. "She actually has a lovely nose. It's the eyes that are a problem." Laurents cast the 19-year-old novice actress in Wholesale to play the musical's daffy secretary. As originally conceived by book writer Jerome Weidman, Miss Marmalstein is a 50-year-old spinster. Laurents ignored that little character trait and kept the teenager in the show, despite the constant complaints leveled against her by the show's tyrannical producer. "David Merrick was after me every night to fire her because she wasn't attractive," said Laurents. The producer, already known on Broadway as the abominable showman, wanted nothing but pretty girls in his musicals, even if they were playing dumpy middle-aged secretaries. Laurents, however, saw something in rehearsals that also stunned Streisand's largely gay following at the Bonsoir. "She was incredibly sexual on stage," he said. Merrick was one of those straight men who didn't see it. Perhaps he never saw it, but there was no not noticing the audience's reaction when, out of town in Philadelphia, Streisand sang Miss Marmalstein as she coasted across the stage in an office chair on rollers. Laurents gave the show's choreographer, Herbert Ross, credit for the chair. The performer who played the singing secretary on wheels remembered it differently. "We disagreed about the Miss Marmalstein number," said Streisand. "She was the overworked secretary, and I envisioned her singing that song in a secretarial chair that rolls. That's why I asked for a chair during the audition." Arthur and Herb Ross had a different concept, with lots of the cast walking behind me while I was at my desk, but it never seemed to work until opening night in Philadelphia, when they finally gave in and said, "Do it in your goddamn chair." I stopped the show that night, and they weren't very happy with me afterwards. The new musical was supposed to revive the moribund careers of singer-actress Lillian Roth and ballet theater's Harold Lang, a former Laurents boyfriend, whose last Broadway success had been a decade earlier in the first major revival of Pal Joey. Roth and Lang were the two names known to Broadway ticket buyers, and comeback stories were always good box office. The introduction of a new star was even better box office, and Laurents saw something immediately in the young Streisand that straight men like Merrick could not, because he and others like him could not get beyond her nose. Streisand had it, and it wasn't only her incredible voice and her great comic timing, but that she also exuded sex. Here was a woman who enjoyed sex, just like her gay following did, and she was getting it just like they were, despite all the odds of her unconventional appearance and their unconventional sexual orientation. And she was getting it with straight men whom gay men could only fantasize about sleeping with. It's what linked Streisand to such other icons of the gay world as Betty Davis and Judy Garland, who, not being conventionally pretty, weren't afraid to flaunt their sexual aggression. Having lots of sex wasn't only for the glamorous idols adored by homosexuals, women like Joan Crawford and Marlene Dietrich. Years later, it would be Laurents who recognized that it was Streisand and not Redford, the conventionally pretty one, who brought sex to the pairing in the way we were. She gives him sex, and he gives her class, he said, parroting what Katharine Hepburn once said about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. Truth be told, Redford always had more sex appeal than Astaire, and Streisand always had more class than Rogers. Despite Streisand's wholesale success, Stark and his wife Fran, especially his wife Fran, did not envision Fanny Brice being played by this young Jewish upstart from Brooklyn with that nose. They didn't take Stephen Sondheim's advice before Bob Merrill replaced him as the funny girl lyricist. "You've got to have a Jewish girl," Sondheim insisted, "and if she's not Jewish, she at least has to have a nose." Streisand never forgot the way that Starks and Merrick treated her. She flaunted being the star that didn't get a nose job, and she defused the issue with humor. In a Life magazine interview, she revealed, "There is a joke about a girl who went to the hairdresser and said, 'Give me a Barbra Streisand look.' So he took the hairbrush and broke her nose." Her sense of humor, however, never completely washed away the resentment. It fueled Streisand. Even her first playbill bio announced that Miss Streisand is not a member of the Actors Studio. The flip side of resentment is a lack of gratitude, but that grudge complex was to come a little later. Yes, the producer's ownership thing with the star was very, very complicated. No doubt Laurents's relationship with Streisand would have been even more complicated if the writer had accepted Stark's original offer that he, Laurents, write the book for the stage musical Funny Girl. Laurents expressed no interest in the subject. Among other things, he'd recently written another backstage story, Gypsy, and it was doubtful he would improve on what most critics considered the best book ever written for a musical. Although their working relationship ended with I Can Get It For You Wholesale, which ran for 300 performances, Streisand stayed in touch with Laurents, most notably right after the release of her LP debut, the Barbra Streisand album, in 1963. By then, Streisand had already graduated from her kooky, antique clothing store get-ups to her exotic Nefertiti look with the flamboyantly contoured eyes and hair. Beyond fashion advice, she wanted performance tips from her stage mentor. A couple of years before, Laurents had told her not to lower her face when performing at the Bonsoir. She thought it had something to do with her nose. No, the shadows emphasized her double chin, he replied. Now she expected praise from Laurents for a first album that had garnered raves from the critics. Having just ended her January engagement at the Blue Angel and looking to open for Liberace at the Riviera in Las Vegas, she felt insecure about performing solo at such a big venue. Could Laurents offer any advice? Yes, but not the kind she wanted. Laurents gave her a lambasting, and that included an accusation that she had imitated his good friend Lena Horne, among other crimes, on her album. The comment provoked Streisand to write,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?